We're so lucky to have with us today Dr. Kristen Barnett to provide a keynote speech entitled Research for an Indigenous Future. Dr. Kristen Barnett is Unangan and a professor of American Studies at Bates College in Maine. Dr. Barnett specializes in Indigenous and decolonizing frameworks and their applications in teaching, research, and service. Additional areas of expertise include data and research sovereignty, adult and community education workshops, and collaborative development of inclusive practices in curriculum design. She has served on numerous committees, including as chair for the Committee on Native American Relations for the Society for American Archaeology, as well as an expert panelist on topics of research sovereignty and decolonization, racial inclusivity, caretaking in the workplace, and gender discrimination. Dr. Barnett has been the recipient of multiple funding awards from the National Science Foundation for her work in research and data sovereignty and decolonizing practices. She finds inspiration and comfort in her two sons, her dog, fishing, and the outdoors. Thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Barnett, and I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Julie, for the introduction. Akwana Hunuk Satuko Kristen Barnett Atu Unanga. I'm happy to see you all, and my name is Kristen Barnett. I am Nungan or Ali. My family originates from the island of Atu, and we are now located mostly in Southwest Alaska in Naknek and King Salmon. I'm the daughter and granddaughter of Leslie Barnett, Martha Hansen, Annie McGlashan, and Thekla Prokopioff, and I hope today to honor them as I feel honored by them. I also want to thank you for the invitation to speak today, because it's an honor to give a keynote address together with all of you, but more so because Alaska is my home. My talk today is titled Research for an Indigenous Future. I want to discuss and problematize concepts of research, but also what it means to dream of an Indigenous future and how we can come around to a place where these two things, research and Indigenous futurity, unite. Each village and community has their own idea of what an Indigenous future will look like for them. Each community is unique, yet we're faced with similar challenges and circumstances, particularly impacts from ongoing research in or near our homelands, including continuous requests for partnership, collaboration, co-production of knowledge, or permissions in the form of letters of support on behalf of individuals and institutions that we may or may not know, or that we may never meet. The topics I address today are relational and entangled, and as I work through these, my goal is not to create a prescriptive set of guidelines or rules, but I do offer a pathway for those interested in their pursuit. My own work as an academic and researcher is situated within Indigenous frameworks that include both research and data sovereignty as a way to develop and carry out a specific type of research. And today, I'll share my ideas about these concepts, including barriers to carrying them out, and methodologies and imaginings for overcoming these barriers and uniting people and interests. The barriers that I'll identify may at times seem irreconcilable, and a critical assessment of current and ongoing research may even be perceived as pessimistic. But contrary to that perception, I argue that critical assessment is an act of optimism and hope, a way to identify issues so that we can find a way to resolve, reimagine, and in this case, to indigenize a collaborative pathway forward. At times, many times, Native peoples have been perceived by scientists and researchers as being anti or apart from science, acting as a barrier to progress with Western scientific research, and particularly when research requires access, permission, or consultation with communities. But nothing could be farther from the truth. This only comes a concern if we limit our understanding of science to that of a Western science. In our settler colonial nation, we're taught to think there's only one science, right? As if Western science owns scientific inquiry. Western scientific thought is not the first to ask questions about the world around us. We have thousands of generations of Native, Indigenous science and scientists within our communities. And this often becomes categorized as a separate place of traditional knowledge or TEK relegating it to a category that places it apart from science, right? Something more anecdotal in its application. But the knowledge, wisdom, and experience within our community intellectuals is not anecdotal. We have an understanding of the world that connects us to our earth, the sky, stars, planets, our animal and human relations, water, mountains, and the living beings that we have been responsible to for thousands of generations. Indigenous science, right? Indigenous science recognizes these relations. Unlike Western science, we don't seek to claim a scientific objectivity that results in moral detachment. But I do want to be clear, right? We are scientists. It's important to provide a brief overview today of settler colonialism because it bears responsibility for much of what I'm going to speak to today. Colonialism itself, right? Colonialism brings outsiders to lands that then set up a space for themselves, impose a dominant power in order to extract resources such as food, furs, minerals, labors. But settler colonialism, it one-ups this, right? Settler colonialism seeks not only to extract resources, but also decides to move in, to take ownership and occupy the land, imposing their own ways of being onto all those previously present. This is even responsible for how we become native, right, or indigenous, because these designations are only in relation to the settler, right, colonizer, or in Alaska, right, pioneers. So settler colonialism is this overarching structure. If we give it human form for the sake of understanding today, settler colonialism is the structure, it's the head, requiring a body to help it achieve its goals and continue to persist. And so we'll work through this today using a human form to understand it, right? We have one arm of settler colonialism would be capitalism, and this is an economic structure, right, that thrives on extraction. It also creates and prioritizes individual profit and prospering of one over others, while establishing this new form of currency that replaces traditional marketplaces of trade, barter, exchange, or other types of currency. Another arm would be religion. A religious imposition, new religion, disrupts and replaces sacred traditions and religions that have connected us spiritually to one another and to the world around us, imposing a new moral structure for us. This even made native religions and spiritual practice illegal. Then we have the laws and the policies. These establish a secular set of societal rules and norms, including penalties for non-adherence. And these interfere with and remove sovereign rights to regulate our own communities. And it was even against the law to engage in traditional sacred spiritual practice and ritual until 1978, when the American Indian Religious Freedom Act was enacted. And finally, most relevant to our discussion today is education. Less than 50% of the textbooks in the United States primary and secondary schools, kindergarten through 12th grade, mention Native people. And those that do rarely speak accurately of us. I grew up not even knowing the word colonialism, despite the way it had impacted our lives, traditions, and communities. Children, right, now our elders, were sent to boarding schools to be assimilated into Western society. These were places that gave them new names, assigned them numbers, forced child labor as a form of economic profit, and also sought to take their language and dignity, among other things. So settler colonialism seeks to dispossess Native peoples of their culture, lands, traditions, pride, histories, and teachings. And as more people begin to recognize and increase in awareness about the ongoing impacts of settler colonialism, it's also become responsible for more calls to decolonize, to reclaim our lifeways and dignity, to reclaim our knowledge as legitimate and valuable, and to exercise our sovereignty. So recognizing settler colonialism and its ongoing impacts, as well as the calls to decolonize and reclaim these dignities, including our Indigenous science, allows us to dream an Indigenous future, including allowing us to imagine research and collaboration. So what does it mean when a Western scientist or researcher comes in and asks an Indigenous scientist and researcher to collaborate? What does it mean then to co-produce knowledge? And what does it mean to demand research and data sovereignty? So sovereignty, this is our definition. It is the power, authority, and inherent right for Native peoples to govern themselves, including their own internal affairs. Alaska tribes have inherent sovereignty, and this has been recognized by all three branches of the government as well as the Supreme Court. This recognizes that we were self-governing nations long before settler colonialism arrived. So when considering questions of collaboration framed within our own sovereignty, the power dynamic shifts. We're exploring this new space, right? A preliminary or transitional space referred to as liminality, right? The in-between. And this can sometimes be perceived as stress-inducing, right? A nowhere, an unknown. But right now, right, this liminality is a place of agency and power and a place to dream an Indigenous future. A quick Google search, right? A quick Google for Arctic research funding results in a lot of opportunities for scholars to submit proposals for support. Just the first page of search results include UArctic, NSF, World Wildlife, the Ray Anderson Foundation, and the Future for Nature. And these were just the top results. There were also ones that were paying for ads. But when reviewing these search results, climate change and nature are the predominant themes, and they're easily identified at a glance. And these funders are actively soliciting proposals for new research. These include solicitations from NSF for navigating a new Arctic, this urgent call for research. And these solicitations occur without consent or consideration from Arctic communities, sovereign tribal nations. These calls for research echo, right? They duplicate the calls of early settler colonialism, ones that called out to pioneers, to settlers to come to the final frontier, right? Suggesting it as this empty landscape, just waiting for their arrival, waiting to be populated, to be taken, to be studied and extracted from. So part of this urgency is the dystopian outlook of the future when thinking about climate change, right? This is the fear of having lives, livelihoods, access to resources disrupted for the larger settler nation. The Arctic and subarctic are being disproportionately impacted, making it an ideal place of inquiry for science. Research in the face of climate change has created a perspective within the scientific community that has framed the environmental impacts of climate change in the Arctic as the library is burning, right? It's an urgency, and it incentivizes research and researchers to work at accelerated speeds to access these lands before they're gone or no longer recognizable. And this is really important work, but I am always left feeling uncomfortable, right? Wondering where communities fit into these priorities of well-being, of care, and of security. And at the same time, there's this really interesting thing happening as this urgent call to increase research. There's also this new trend towards community participatory research, right? Community engaged research. And the two agendas act in direct opposition to one another. This urgency requires an acceleration of time, and community partnership requires a slowing of time. But despite the oppositional needs of each, the community engaged paradigm continues to gain attention in research communities. And this has led to a popularization of concepts not fully realized, such as co-production of knowledge, community engaged, and research sovereignty. And there has become this coded language, right, used in proposals for new research that allows for a competitive edge. It signals a new kind of research. While they also lack in specificity when it comes to moving past only thinking about these principles and actually applying them. So in turn, this produces research designs that sound new and progressive, but because we currently lack agreed upon definitions and methods for this work, there are few, if any, measures of accountability. So to illustrate this point, I'll share with you the outcomes of a recent inquiry I completed. I was curious if my suspicions about these coded language was new, if they were founded, and so I conducted a search of a recently funded National Science Foundation research. I was able to narrow my search by region, right, Alaska, And I searched for key terminology of community engaged work, and I was amazed with the number of results. There were close to 200 funded community engaged research projects. So I couldn't review each individually, so I randomly reviewed 20%. And during this review, there were these recurrent themes of these popularized terms: community engaged, co-production of knowledge. But despite this, less than 1% of those that I sampled had actually been invited to collaborate. Most demonstrated no previous relationship with the community that they planned to work with. And although I found this repeated desire to do this work, there were no statements clarifying how this work would be done in a way that distinguished it from orthodox Western research paradigms. So one of the difficulties of transitioning from orthodox Western research to community-engaged, collaborative, co-produced research is that orthodox perspectives don't fully recognize this as indigenizing research. Indigenizing is something fundamentally different than just adding collaboration to an orthodox research design. Few educational institutions incorporate Indigenous studies into their science programs, right? And Indigenous studies transcends disciplinary bounds. It's a place of scholarship and education that's twofold. First, it creates a home for Native students, while also educating all students about Native history, experience, identities, and most importantly for researchers, it identifies and complicates Western ontologies and epistemologies. For many non-Native students, it is the first time they will learn that their experience, their worldview, and their values and beliefs are not universal. It will also be the first time many of them learn about Native sovereignty. So Native scholars and community intellectuals have critiqued orthodox scientific research, but none more powerful than that of Vine Deloria Jr. in his book, Red Earth, White Lies. In this book, he carefully critiqued the extractive nature of scientific research, the get in, get what you need, and get out that prevails among these orthodox researchers. And although he published this in 1997, right, more than 30 years ago, or nearly 30 years ago, it remains relevant today. And we can see with current trends that we're seeing now that to formulate new research structure, we need to formulate new research structures that unite peoples, communities, and interests. So I've identified three main barriers that challenge the ability to fully realize a collaborative, engaged, reciprocal research, right, and indigenized research. The first is concepts of individualism, right, ownership of intellectual knowledge, and a primary responsibility of a researcher to the funding agencies. The second is this concept, again, of Western scientific objectivism, which Margaret Redsteer, a scholar at Western Washington University, defines as creating moral detachment. And third is time. Now, all three of these can be resolved if we rely on an Indigenous, right, or if you're not an Indigenous person, an Indigenous-centered framework. So the popular trends and coded words that indicate collaborative, community, and co-produced research are often accompanied by references to decolonizing. But none of these occur without the indigenizing of research, including a recognition of the ways that settler colonialism functions and continues to inform Western values. So I'll give you an example of my own discipline. In my own discipline, there's this growing interest in Indigenous archaeology. This is an archaeology that does collaborative, co-produced, and sometimes decolonizing work. But one of the challenges we face is that the Indigenous archaeologists are not necessarily Native, First Nations, or Indigenous. And this is concerning to me for two reasons. First is that being an Indigenous scholar brings a particular identity and experience, including Indigenous ontologies and epistemologies. And thinking about the way that settler colonialism has functioned in the US, assimilation has been a primary goal, particularly through education. So this assimilative education has created hierarchies that place these Western epistemologies at the top, suggesting that they're the only valid or rigorous ways of knowing. And so it's important that we bring our voices. Secondly, this erases or disappears Indigenous people, right? And this act has been has happened and been reproduced through the process of appropriation. For example, New Age religions appropriate sacred Native rituals and ceremonies. We have Halloween costumes of Native people, mascots, summer camps that enact performances of racialized Native peoples. There's homogenization and appropriation of dream catchers that you can find at almost every gas station in the lower 48. And now we have academia producing Indigenous scholarship without Indigenous people. All of these appropriations result in profit or benefit of performing Native or Indigenous tradition while further erasing the existence and sovereign rights of Native peoples, suggesting that we, Native peoples, have disappeared. And this makes it more important than ever to ensure the inclusion and amplification of Native voices, and that Indigenous scholarship be carried out, right, and led by Indigenous peoples. So while I restrict Indigenous research to Indigenous practitioners, the same exact research framework can be practiced by a diverse representation of non-Indigenous scholars and researchers. It should simply be designated as Indigenous-centered research. This is not only possible, but like highly recommended. Indigenous-centered research provides an important distinction that recognizes a shift in paradigm, moving away from orthodox Western research while avoiding an unintentional appropriation of Indigenous identity. So Indigenous and Indigenous-centered research requires a specific methodology that's informed by the individual researcher's standpoint that's comprised of the following, right? The researcher's epistemology, what they themselves consider counts as knowledge. The researcher's ontology, the nature of being. Their axiology, really what they see as having value and importance, as well as the researcher's social position, right? Who they are, what they've experienced, their class, and all of these other relational identities. So the standpoint determines the way that a researcher develops questions and that and what they determine to be important, what information they deem as valuable, and all of these inform their theoretical framework. And I like to think of this as a lens in which they view their research through, right? A theoretical lens is kind of like a pair of sunglasses. If all of us that are in this workshop today went out on a bright day, right? Some of us might pull out sunglasses, some might shield our eyes, but we would all have some sort of adaptation, right? For experiencing that, that sunlight. And so we would look around and we might see that some of us have like dark lenses, some may have gold lenses, the shapes may be different. And so what that does is it provides a way for all of us to see the same thing, but experience it in a slightly different way, right? And that is a theoretical lens. So identifying and understanding this lens is important because it informs the methods we select for generating data and analyzing data in order to address our original research questions. So one of the challenges orthodox researchers can have adapting to an Indigenous-centered research is that there are no prescriptive methods. This becomes even more challenging when writing a research proposal because funders themselves rely on clearly outlined methods to determine if the research is feasible. I've developed a specific set of methods that rely on Indigenous research values that are flexible enough to be adapted to place, space, and individual communities. And I refer to these as the 4 R's, which are not unique to me, but I'll outline them as methods in a particular way. And these 4 R's being relationality, responsibility, reciprocity, and reparation, or rematriation, or some people would refer to it as repatriation. So these 4 R's act as a reference guide when developing methods while establishing accountability for the researcher and for their partners. And I'll offer a few examples of how to conceptualize these, right? Relationality as a guiding principle, right, would help you determine how your methods demonstrate that you will care, that you will know and care for each other. The guiding principle of responsibility determines how the researcher is going to answer to the community. And this would be reflected again in those specific methods. Reciprocity helps us to identify how we're going to benefit a community that's benefiting you. And reparation or rematriation, right? What are the ways that you are going to ensure the ownership and control of heritage, knowledge, wisdom, experience, and land that you're being given the privilege of accessing and working with? So these methods don't require that a researcher adopt or appropriate Indigenous epistemologies or axiologies, values. Rather, they provide a clear avenue for recognizing our sovereignty and prioritizing the community that you're partnering with. The framework that I've outlined benefits and enriches all research, and anyone can implement and indigenize their research, and they should. A researcher will always benefit from doing research. They're building their professional resume or CV, they're receiving promotions or tenure, they're benefiting from the experience in the way that it can influence and enrich their teaching or publications. They become, in fact, professionally legitimized. These 4 R's allow for place-based, community-specific adaptations that ensure the communities are centered and the outcomes are both relevant and beneficial. Right, this framework also addresses the first 2 barriers researchers face when attempting to adapt to this type of research. First, it addresses concepts of individualism, ownership, and the primary responsibility being perceived as being that to funding agencies. And secondly, it addresses concepts of Western scientific objectivism. The 4 R's require a thorough exploration by the researcher of their own positionality and the influence this bears on their research. This complicates and deconstructs the myth of scientific objectivity while developing clearly articulated community responsibilities with avenues for assessment. These methods also require an ongoing engagement, interaction, and familiarity, right, relationality on behalf of the researcher. But the third barrier remains, right, because it requires time to transform orthodox research into a co-produced, community-engaged, indigenized framework. Now, there's no replacement for time, and this is the most complicated of the barriers to overcome with respect to developing this new research design. Indigenous and Indigenous-centered research requires a relationship in order to develop trust. And this investment of time can be a challenge for researchers and funders that have not fully interrogated the way the extractive nature of orthodox research impacts communities, including the burden placed on communities to invest in short-term relationships that rarely yield a benefit. A fully indigenized research relies on relationship building prior to thinking about conducting research. Even a researcher with the best intentions for community partnership, co-production, and collaborative work cannot design a collaborative research alone. The co-production, collaboration, and partnership begins at the level of research development, ideally by invitation, fully recognizing our sovereignty. So I recently watched a new TV series called Rutherford Falls. And this is a rare show that engages in complicated issues and ongoing impacts of settler colonialism from a place of indigeneity. So one of the main characters, I have her on the screen here, is Regan Wells, and she's played by Jana Schmiedling, who is a Lakota Sioux actress, and she's also one of the series writers. So the premise of her character is that Regan left her tribal community abruptly, right? She walked away from a wedding to another tribal member after being surprised by a letter accepting her into a college. So in this series, she has just returned with her master's degree and she's ready to be present in her community again, right? Her goal is to build a tribal cultural center at the casino, one that's going to offer, one that's going to honor her community. And what she finds quickly is that she has no support from the community, right? As a result of canceling her wedding and making this rapid departure for college, she's broken relationships. And there's reparations that need to be made. She needed to regain trust in order to rebuild her relations and support. The building of these relations not only required apology, but more importantly, they required an investment of time and self. It took time for her to demonstrate that she cared, to honor her community and regain that trust. She eventually succeeded, but in order to do so, she has to show up over and over again consistently to prove this isn't fleeting interest. And I loved this part of the show because it really resonated deeply with me. She spent extensive time doing things that were outside of the expertise and education she acquired. She taught community yoga classes. She chopped firewood for elders, among other things. In her desire to build a cultural center, she thought that her time was best spent focusing on the orthodox methods that she had acquired in college, such as getting donations, writing grants, curating things, acquiring funding. But instead, that she found the primary method required for this work was to be present and rebuild her relations. Effectively, she applied the 4 R's. This is the foundation of Indigenous and Indigenous-centered research. I think of the times I thought I'd be meeting with traditional council to discuss research topics, and instead I found myself delivering groceries. When my students go to the field with me, they question how picking up trash around the school is research. And by the end, they understand. A commitment to this research also requires reevaluating collaborations. Your research partners must share your commitment. At one point, I planned on collaborating with a particular geologist. And when I outlined our fieldwork schedule for them, which included volunteering during E-Week at the school to teach a place-based course, basketball a few nights a week with at the end with a community feast and a big basketball game, and a celebration that included attending graduation, and if we were lucky, getting an invitation to prom. And they said that they would join me in the field after this because they didn't need a cultural experience. And so I canceled the collaboration. But the most important parts of my collaboration have been picking greens for sick community members. I'm transferring food from the school freezer to interim storage space when the school freezer failed, right? Having the honor to attend prom, and this was a really big deal because that was my first prom ever. And particularly the elders noting the respect that my college students that I brought there, the respect that my college students demonstrated when they attended events and showed up year after year. Another important aspect of my work is returning. The students in the community, the K through 12 students that I work with, each year when we leave, their main question is, when will you be back? Because coming back sends a clear message. They're important. So in order to overcome this last barrier of time, I look to institutions, funding agencies, and foundations to reimagine the way that they allocate funds, right? Imagine if there was funding provided for relationship building, funding to be present and sit in community, not with the hope of getting to enact your own research agenda, but solely for the purpose of building and being in relation with one another. If we reimagine money as medicine, a form of healing, reparation, recognition, and responsibility, we will allocate it differently. So this interruption of urgency and slowing of time contributes to decolonizing research. The examples I've provided you with allow you to see the ways this interruption decenters the researcher, the institution, or the discipline, and centers the community. Disrupting timelines and taking or making time is the path to community engaged partnership and collaboration because time is a uniting factor. Current efforts by foundations and funding agencies to create accountability for the researcher have contributed to the burden on communities due to requests for permission and collaboration, facilitating an overwhelming number of researchers imagining their own futures in the Arctic. But funding agencies have an opportunity as well as a responsibility to recognize our sovereign nations and reimagine a practice that holds themselves accountable for these burdens, right? Destabilizing orthodox, antiquated protocols and developing new practices within our own agencies and foundations. Now, these methods do not facilitate a higher number of individual projects, right? They can, however, reimagine projects themselves as communities of researchers, and the quality and benefit of this research experience and the outcomes is improved significantly for everyone. So the recommendations I've outlined above create real possibilities that allow for a reimagination of funding allocation that privileges relationship building in addition to rewarding Indigenous frameworks. Right, centering these 4 R's further addresses the barriers to the development and adaptations of community engaged, co-produced, indigenized partnerships for research sovereignty. So I spent a lot of time detailing practices, protocols, methodologies for researchers, funders, and even institutions. But I want to conclude my address by speaking primarily to the people that make up the sovereign tribal villages and communities. First, as many of you know, but I still want to emphasize, we can be both Native and researchers. Our futures are ours. In 2019, the Journal of Higher Education reported on the demographics of current student enrollment in undergraduate institutions, and they were as follows. Black students comprised 15%, not much, but this was projected to increase over the coming 5 years. Latina students comprised 13%, and that was also projected to increase over the coming 5 years. 1% was comprised of Native American, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian combined, a number that was projected to decrease over the coming 5 years. In addition, in the 2018-19 academic year, 0.03% of all doctorate degrees awarded in the United States were awarded to Native students. That is only 720 out of 187,563 doctorate degrees. So the prioritizing of Indigenous and decolonizing research that recognizes our sovereignty, it empowers our future generations. Prioritizing framework that sees us, honors us, as the ones that gain tribal and community support sends a message to everyone, including our youth. Knowing that research can be ceremony encourages our youth to pursue post-secondary education and degrees that will bring them back home to their relations, meeting responsibilities to community and land. Education does not need to sever us. Now, as I noted earlier, this is a liminal time, a time of transition and a time of change, this in-between place. This is a place of incredible possibility, agency, and power, a place for us to dream our futures. Our communities have the power to regulate the type of research that occurs and what community priorities and needs it can meet. We can use the 4 R's to inform our own engagement in research. We don't have to wait for invitations to speak to funding agencies and researchers. We can exercise our power and our sovereignty through the decisions that we make, who we allow to join and partner with our communities, including the type of research we choose to write letters of support for. Because as sovereign nations, we possess self-determination and the opportunity to shape the future as an Indigenous one. I emphasize the power of our communities because this dominant structure of settler colonialism and the body of structures that have supported it, capitalism, education, laws, and policies, and religion, has tried to teach us that we don't have that power. An Indigenous future does not dispossess or disenfranchise anyone. The fear that Native and Indigenous peoples would have the settler nation treated in the same manner that we've been treated dispossesses us of our dignity. What we need is a future that unites us and that benefits us all. And I'd like to conclude by saying, Kaga Sakang. Koyana, and thank you. It is the greatest honor to be invited into this space, and I hope I've honored you in the same way you've honored me. I want to thank the community of Kawerak, elders, students, community, intellectuals. I've missed you deeply and am pained by the disruption that COVID-19 has caused in our relations and our work together. And I'd also like to thank Anna Kurtula, formerly of NSF, for her ethics, determination, and creativity that allowed for her to imagine an Indigenous future and generously support my work. Thank you.